At Mount Vernon sits a portrait of the King of Prussia, Frederick the Great. The first president and all of the founding fathers always greatly admired him, both militarily and politically, considering Frederick was the first man to acknowledge the legitimacy of the United States. In 1806, when Napoleon Bonaparte conquered Prussia, he visited the tomb of Frederick in Potsdam, saying to his generals, "Hats off, gentlemen. If he were alive today, we would not be here." He also considered Frederick to be one of the greatest generals of all time. In 1945, as Berlin was crumbling under the fire of Red Army guns, in the bunker of Adolf Hitler stood a portrait of Frederick. He was greatly admired by all the high-ranking Nazis and was the subject of many German propaganda films. Frederick the Great, or Frederick II of Prussia, was born to his father, King Frederick William I, and Hanoverian mother, Sophia Dorothea. Frederick was born into the House of Hohenzollern, a dynasty that would eventually unify Germany and would not be ended until Kaiser Wilhelm was forced to abdicate the throne after the end of the First World War. The Hohenzollern family was given the electorate of Brandenburg in 1525. They were an early German Protestant royal family. During the 30 Years' War, the Great Elector, Frederick William, was forced to side with Gustavus Adolphus, as Frederick would detail in his memoirs of the House of Brandenburg. It was a short history on the Prussian state to that point in his life. He shows how Gustavus Adolphus forced the Elector of Brandenburg, George William, to support his cause, saying there would be no neutral states in this war. Thus, they benefited from the 30 Years' War, though they would not become their own kingdom until 1701, when Frederick I, or Frederick, I believe, the Sixth of Prussia, was made a promise to the Habsburgs to aid their cause against the Bourbons in the War of Spanish Succession. Frederick II was born on January 24th, 1712, in Berlin City Palace. Frederick's father, Frederick William, became king in 1713 after Frederick I died. Frederick grew up reading the great literature of the day, though he was not as interested in his biblical studies as his father had wished him to be. Frederick William had a strong idea of what he believed a king to be: someone who was an enthusiastic soldier, a pious Christian, and an avid hunter. Frederick was given a tutorial team headed by Jacques Duhan, a French Huguenot refugee, who tutored Frederick in history, religion, language, and other such things which his father wished him to learn. The young Frederick had a way of feigning interest in something his father liked. He was seen as much more crafty than his more disciplined father. By age 12, his father, Frederick William, would even say, "I would very much like to know what is going on in that little head. I'm aware that Fritz doesn't share my tastes, and I also know there are people who have filled him with contrary notions and who rubbish everything I do." Frederick and his father also differed on religion. Frederick, although of course never outright saying he was an atheist, seemed to always question Christianity, and he always criticized Christianity for holding back the sciences. He was at least certainly a deist, or called philosopher, which basically meant deist in that time. Frederick joined his father on a trip to the Saxon capital of Dresden in February 1728. It was here where Frederick would experience the much more decadent and extravagant court of Augustus the Strong of Saxony. It was on this trip that Frederick attended his first opera, Johann Adolph Haas's Clothied. Sorry for mispronunciation. In 1728, his Hanoverian mother had hoped to marry Frederick to the daughter of George I. Frederick was excited by this, considering she was thought to be from a more enlightened England. Though Frederick William initially supported the idea, but eventually turning against the idea because at this time he had become dismayed with anything that gave his son pleasure. Frederick I instead opted for a marriage to Elizabeth Christian of Brunswick. His relationship with his father only got worse and worse over time. In December 1729, Frederick responded to a sneer by his father about the vile clique trying to force his hand in a marriage to the English by saying, "I respect the English because I know the people there love me," to which Frederick William seized him by the collar, thrashed him with a cane, and bashed him over the head. The physical violence only got worse and worse over time. By the summer of 1730, Frederick began to plan an escape from his father's grasp. He planned to escape to France and then possibly England. In this plan, Frederick was assisted by Lieutenant Hans Hermann von Katt and Lieutenant Keith. Though Frederick William soon became aware of his son's plan and had him placed under house arrest, Lieutenant Keith was able to escape the authorities, but Hans Hermann von Katt was not able to avoid capture. Also, his sister Williamine also attempted to help his brother escape, as Williamine recounts in her memoirs meeting her father again after the failed escape. She says, "We all rushed to kiss his hand, but as soon as he caught sight of me, he was overcome by rage and fury. His face went black, his eyes blazed, and he foamed at the mouth. 'You loathsome villain, don't you dare come near me. Get her out of here. She can go join her rogue brother.' He then grabbed my hand and punched me several times." Frederick William had even considered killing Frederick, as Peter the Great had done to Peter the Great of Russia had done to his son, but was ultimately dissuaded against it. Frederick's ultimate punishment was being forced to watch his friend and possibly lover, though we will never know for sure, be executed. At Küstrin on November 6, 1730, Hans Hermann von Katt was executed, while Frederick was forced to watch. As the blade struck Katt's neck, Frederick fainted into the arms of his warders. Frederick was placed under house arrest, and all his books which he loved so much were burned. He was kept under close watch at Küstrin and forced to attend church regularly. He was also forced into marriage with Elizabeth Christian of Brunswick in November 1731. Elizabeth Christian was certainly a more pious Christian and was described as God-fearing later by Frederick. And he meant this as an insult, of course. Though it was the marriage to Elizabeth Christian which gave Frederick some level of freedom from his father's grasp, he was not formally moved in with his wife until 1736 at the Rheinsberg Palace. Frederick's sexuality is one that is often an issue that is debated amongst historians. Certainly this was a question even in his time. He was called a sodomite tyrant by the Habsburg propagandist during the wars. He certainly acted friendly towards his wife. There were rumors of his sexual relations with her. Seemingly pretty normal. That is, until his father's death, of course, which he rarely ever saw her again. And after his father's death, Elizabeth Christian of Brunswick was immediately moved to the Schönhausen, moved out of the Frederick's main home. He was also suspected to have a homosexual relationship with the Italian immigrant Algarati, who was also given a duchy in Prussia as well. Frederick is also famous for his relationship with the French philosopher Voltaire. He began his relationship with Voltaire in 1736, writing to him. And of course, Voltaire, of course, responded. This began a long correspondence between the two that never ended until Voltaire's death. The death of his father in 1740 is the defining turning point in Frederick's life. Now able to run the court the way he saw fit, Frederick's ascension to the throne provided him with sexual and educational liberation from his father's early reign. Upon hearing of the death of Charles, Frederick wrote to his envoy in Vienna, "The Emperor is dead, and the Holy Roman Empire and the House of Austria are leaderless. The monarchy's finances are exhausted, the army is ruined, and the provinces are drained by war, plague, famine, and the terrible burden of taxation they have had to bear up to the present." Though it would be the death of Tsarina Anne on October 17th, which ultimately made the decision for Frederick. As Frederick wrote in his History in My Own Times, the death of Anne, which soon followed that of the emperor, finally determined the king in favor of this enterprise. But as we mentioned earlier, this is him writing in third person. This death made the infant Ivan the Fourth, or excuse me, Ivan the Fifth, not Ivan the Fourth, Ivan the Fifth, the new czar, and would cause a succession crisis that would occur, and it would make it impossible for the Habsburg ally, Russia, to get involved in the conflict. Therefore, it was this action which forced Frederick into invading Silesia. And this would begin the War of Austrian Succession, and consequently, the 7 Years' War as well. The Prussian military operated under the Junkers. The Junkers are the landed nobility of Prussia. The Junkers made up the officer class of the military. Unlike Britain and the Dutch Republic, the burghers and merchants of Berlin were not nearly as wealthy and powerful. The Berlin Cadet Corps began as a training course for young Prussian noblemen in 1717 under Frederick William. Under Frederick William, the Prussian Cadet Corps had received many complaints about the harsh treatment of the young Junkers officers, to which Frederick William would often reply that this was a necessary education. But this was to end under Frederick's reign. He ordered Federals must no longer behave this way towards the cadets in a coarse or boorish manner. Frederick established a way to train for higher command in a systematic way. This is common now, but was not before Frederick. Before, it had been thought that experience was the only measure which counted for promotion. But as Frederick once said, a mule can go on 10 campaigns with Prince Eugene, but will be no better informed by the end of it. In Prussia, the army was recruited almost entirely in the countryside. The function of townsmen was to pay for it through their taxes, not to serve in it. Up to a point, Frederick tried to protect the peasants and the soldiers against the demands of the Junker landlord officers. In 1749 and 1764, he issued decrees limiting the obligations of the peasants to his lord. And in 1748, he ordered officers not to treat their men like serfs. But these were essentially efforts to prevent the plight of the peasants from becoming so desperate that he would be driven into flight and thus jeopardize the majority supply of recruits. Throughout Frederick, in 1744, Frederick ordered the construction of a new palace to be built in Potsdam, outside the capital of Berlin. The Sanssouci Palace, as it came to be known, would serve as Frederick's summer home, and it was a palace of lavish and extravagant culture. In the time of Frederick the Great, Prussia was considered the most enlightened nation in all of Europe. Frederick's legal system was a major achievement. Equality before the law was less elusive than in other European states. Peasants could appeal to the king against landowners. The civil oppression of Jews decreased, and in 1743, the Berlin Journal printed during the carnival season, foreigners as well as native-born Prussians, no matter what their estate, would be permitted to enjoy the operas, plays, and masked balls. The public was consulted on new laws. In an age which judged people by manners, his subjects were impressed that, unlike other monarchs, he took off his hat to anyone whom he encountered. Frederick even housed the provocative French atheist and materialist La Mettrie, whose book *Manner Machine* had him kicked out of all the places in Europe. He was even kicked out of the Dutch Republic. But Frederick, of course, housed him. And he took pride in housing the most provocative atheist in Europe. He commissioned the building of one of the largest opera houses in Europe, and is dedicated to Apollo. Prussia would go on to house many operas and musical composers such as Bach, Johann Philipp Kernberg, and Quantz. Though he did a great deal to promote German culture and Prussian culture, Frederick mostly spoke in French. In 1750, when Voltaire moved into Frederick's Sanssouci Palace in Potsdam, the palace started to become a center of intellectual thought in Europe. Philosophers, artists, musicians, scientists, all around the continent passed through the dinner parties of Frederick. His openness towards all sorts of opinions attracted the attention of the high-class society of Europe quite fast. And Voltaire was a never-changing member of these parties and a close friend of the king. Things changed, however, as Voltaire, with his sharp tongue, started criticizing the acts and policies of the statesmen appointed by Frederick. In 1752, the tensions between them led to a breaking point. When Voltaire felt too uncomfortable in the palace and asked for permission to leave, Frederick refused at first, yet agreed to the permission after a short time. All these events would drastically worsen their relationship, and Voltaire talked quite negatively about his first stay in Prussia in his memoirs. Also, during his time, Voltaire got into several shady business dealings while in Prussia. This also enhanced his bad relationship with the Prussian court. The correspondence between Frederick and Voltaire took a brief pause, but then resumed several years later during the 7 Years' War. In 1759, he found himself in a deep state of depression and thus started writing to his old mentor and friend again. It is observed that at some point in their correspondence, from that point, they reconciled to the degree of their relationship before the breaking point in 1752. They became close again in the late 1770s, before Voltaire's death on May 30th, 1778. Frederick went on to live another 8 years with increasingly despotic and harsh behaviors. He would die in 1786. Frederick carried the values of the Enlightenment throughout his entire life. He was a patron of the arts and sciences, a guarantor of religious freedom and sexual freedom, a servant of the state, but he was also certainly an absolute ruler. He was also the first man to acknowledge the United States. As Frederick wrote in his Anti-Machiavelli, written in 1740, the sovereign is the representative of his state. He and his people form a single body. Ruler and ruled can be happy if they are firmly united. The sovereign stands to his people in the same relation in which the head stands to the body. He must use his eyes and his brain for the whole community and act on its behalf to the common advantage. If we wish to elevate monarchical above republican government, the duty of sovereign is clear. They must be active, hard-working, upright, and honest, and concentrate all their strength upon filling their office worthily. That is my idea of the duties of sovereigns. When Frederick returned home from his victorious campaign on December 28, 1745, after defeating the Habsburgs in the Third War of Austrian Succession, or the Third Silesian War, he was given a hero's welcome in the streets of Berlin. Chants of Frederick the Great rang out through the streets of Berlin.